Our next required Supreme Court case is New York Times Company versus United States. This case is significant because it strengthened the freedom of the press by limiting the government's power to stop newspapers from publishing important information. Let's look at the facts in the case. In the early 1970s, during the Vietnam War, a former government worker leaked a huge collection of secret government documents to the New York Times and the Washington Post. These documents later became known as the Pentagon Papers. They showed that the government had not been fully honest with the public about the war. When the New York Times began publishing parts of the Pentagon Papers, the federal government demanded that the newspaper stop immediately. The government claimed the information could harm national security. Okay, so before we zoom in on the court's holdings, meaning its final decisions, don't forget that you can grab the 1-hour Supreme Court Cases Mastery Playbook that's linked below. It's designed to help you to study all 14 required Supreme Court cases while watching my 1-hour Supreme Court Cases deep dive video, and also includes practice-free response questions for each case. I know from my own students that they want to see samples of completed answers, so this playbook shows you what the full free response answers could look like. And you just need to fill in the gaps to finish them off. This will help you get comfortable with how to master this free response question in the exam. Now, let's look at the court's holdings. First, the court ruled that the newspapers had the First Amendment right to publish the documents. The court explained that the First Amendment protects the freedom of the press, and this protection is especially strong when the press is reporting on government actions. Because of this, the government must show an extremely serious and immediate danger before it can stop publication. And in this case, it failed to meet that high standard. Second, the justices invoked a concept called prior restraint. This is when the government stops publication before it happens. The court said prior restraint is almost always unconstitutional. The justices said that the core purpose of the First Amendment is to ensure the public can stay informed about the actions of those in power, and the government cannot interfere in this process. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is freedom of the press, which is enshrined in the First Amendment. This principle means that newspapers must be free to report on government actions so that citizens can make informed decisions. New York Times versus United States strengthened this principle by placing strict limits on the government's power to block the press from publishing information. Now let's look at one non-required case to see how you could compare this case to another case in the exam. We'll look at Neer versus Minnesota, which went before the court in 1931. In that case, the state of Minnesota tried to shut down a newspaper that had printed harsh criticisms of local officials. The state argued that the paper was scandalous and should be stopped from publishing future issues. The newspaper argued that this violated the freedom of the press under the First Amendment. At the end of the case, the court agreed with the newspaper, holding that Minnesota's law was unconstitutional and restricted free press. Now let's identify the overlapping constitutional clause and concept between Neer versus Minnesota and New York Times Company versus United States. Both cases deal with the idea of prior restraint, which refers to whether the government can stop a newspaper from reporting on information, and the First Amendment Free Press Clause. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in New York Times Company versus United States was that the government could not stop the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers because the First Amendment strongly protects the press from prior restraint. The holding in Neer versus Minnesota was that the state could not shut down the newspaper because doing so was an unconstitutional form of prior restraint. So the holdings are similar because both cases rejected government attempts to block newspapers from publishing, strengthening the freedom of the press under the First Amendment. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question.